Sometimes the smallest favor becomes the beginning of the life you never imagined. I never planned on falling in love with the man next door. When I rented the small white house at the end of Maple Street, all I wanted was a quiet place to start over after spending 2 years rebuilding a life that had fallen apart. The neighborhood was peaceful, filled with tree-lined sidewalks, bicycles leaning against front porches, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting through open kitchen windows every morning. It felt like the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, yet somehow respected the silence people carried with them. The only person I noticed but never truly met was the man living next door. Every weekday at exactly 7:30 in the morning, he would walk out of his front door wearing a neatly pressed dress shirt with the sleeves already rolled to his elbows. One hand held a travel mug, while the other gently rested on the shoulder of a little boy with messy brown hair and the brightest smile I had ever seen. They always left together, but they rarely spoke. The father looked exhausted even before the day began, while the little boy seemed determined to fill the quiet with enough energy for both of them. I would often wave from my porch. The child always waved back with both hands. His father offered nothing more than a polite nod before getting into his SUV and driving away. I assumed he was simply reserved. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, everything changed with a knock on my front door. I opened it to find the same man standing there, his tie loosened, raindrops clinging to his dark hair, and worry written across his face. Up close, I realized he looked younger than I had expected, maybe his mid-30s, but the tiredness in his blue eyes made him seem older. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice calm but strained. "My name is Daniel Brooks. My meeting downtown is running late, and Oliver's school just called. Would you be willing to pick him up for me? It's only about 4 miles away. I'll be home as soon as I can." Of all the things I expected from my mysterious neighbor, asking a stranger for help wasn't one of them. I hesitated, for only a second before smiling. Of course, I'd be happy to. Relief softened his expression so quickly that it almost hurt to watch. He thanked me twice before handing me a visitor pass and the school's pickup instructions, apologizing again as if asking for help was something he had forgotten how to do. 20 minutes later, I walked into the elementary school office where a cheerful secretary called Oliver's name. The little boy came running down the hallway carrying a backpack almost as big as he was. He stopped when he saw me, looked me up and down with complete seriousness, then asked, "You're the nice neighbor, right?" I laughed. "I hope so." He grinned, reached for my hand without the slightest hesitation, and said, "Daddy said I could trust you." As his tiny fingers wrapped around mine, I felt something shift inside me. I didn't know it then, but that single sentence would quietly change all 3 of our lives. When we stepped outside the school, the rain had already stopped, leaving the sidewalks glistening beneath the late afternoon sun. Oliver swung our joined hands as if we had known each other for years instead of minutes. He pointed at everything we passed, from a bright red cardinal perched on a mailbox to a golden retriever sleeping on a neighbor's porch. Every few steps he stopped to tell me another story, and every story somehow circled back to his father. "Daddy makes the best pancakes, but he burns the first one every Saturday," he announced proudly. A minute later he whispered, "Daddy says superheroes always help people even when they are tired." Then he looked up at me with innocent curiosity. "Are you tired too?" I smiled before answering honestly. "Sometimes." He nodded as though that made perfect sense. "Daddy is tired all the time." His words lingered in my mind long after he skipped ahead to inspect a row of colorful flowers planted beside the sidewalk. By the time we reached their house, I realized how quiet the place felt. It was beautiful, with white shutters, a neatly trimmed lawn, and a wooden porch decorated with hanging ferns. Yet it lacked the warmth that usually came from a family home. Inside, everything was spotless, almost too perfect, as if someone had carefully arranged every object and then forgotten to actually live there. Oliver kicked off his sneakers and headed straight for the kitchen. "Daddy keeps snacks in the second cabinet," he said with complete confidence before holding up a box of crackers for my approval. While he ate at the kitchen island, I wandered only as far as the living room doorway. Framed photographs lined the fireplace mantel. Most showed Daniel smiling beside a woman with warm brown eyes and shoulder-length hair. In nearly every picture, Oliver was much younger, sitting on one of their laps with the same bright grin he still wore today. One photograph caught my attention more than the others. It showed the 3 of them standing on a beach at sunset, barefoot in the sand, looking completely carefree. The frame had been polished so often that not a single fingerprint remained on the glass. I quietly looked away before Oliver noticed where my eyes had gone. Less than 15 minutes later, the sound of tires pulling into the driveway broke the silence. The front door opened almost immediately, and Daniel stepped inside, breathing heavily from rushing home. His shoulders finally relaxed the instant he saw Oliver happily coloring at the kitchen table. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. Oliver ran straight into his arms. Daniel hugged him tightly before looking at me with unmistakable gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "I know this was a lot to ask from someone I barely know." "It was not a problem," I replied. "He was excellent company." Oliver laughed. "I told Noah all about your burned pancakes." Daniel closed his eyes for a second and shook his head with a quiet chuckle that sounded unfamiliar, almost as though he had not laughed in a very long time. "I guess some family secrets are not staying secret anymore." It was only a brief moment, but watching the corners of his mouth lift made the entire room feel different. As I walked back to my own house a few minutes later, I glanced over my shoulder. Daniel was standing at the window, watching Oliver chatter excitedly while unpacking his backpack. For the first time since moving to Maple Street, I realized. The man next door was not distant because he disliked people. He was carrying a loneliness so heavy that even asking for help had felt like an impossible step, and somehow, without meaning to, I had just become part of the routine that was keeping him going. The next afternoon, just as I finished unpacking another box in my living room, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. It was short, polite, and almost apologetic. "I hate to ask again, but my afternoon meeting was extended. Could you please pick Oliver up today? Only if it is convenient." I smiled before typing back, "I will be there." Somehow, that simple exchange became our routine. One afternoon turned into two, then three, and before I realized it, I found myself walking the familiar route to Oliver's elementary school nearly every weekday. The teachers greeted me by name. The crossing guard waved whenever he saw us coming. Oliver would race out of the building with the same unstoppable energy, his backpack bouncing behind him as he hurried toward me. Every day, he had another story waiting. Sometimes it was about a science experiment that made the classroom smell terrible. Sometimes it was about a spelling test he thought he had failed before proudly admitting he earned 100%. The walk home always felt shorter because he filled every minute with laughter. One Thursday, instead of heading straight home, we stopped at the neighborhood grocery store. Oliver insisted we needed ingredients for grilled cheese sandwiches because, according to him, Daddy always forgets to buy enough cheese. I laughed so hard that an elderly cashier smiled at us as if she already believed we were family. When we arrived at Daniel's house, Oliver immediately climbed onto a kitchen stool while I prepared lunch. He carefully arranged tomato slices on a plate, announcing that presentation mattered because cooking shows always said so. By the time Daniel walked through the front door an hour later, the kitchen smelled of toasted bread and homemade tomato soup. He froze for a moment, looking around as though he had stepped into someone else's home. Oliver proudly held up his sandwich. "We made extra for you." Daniel set his briefcase on the floor without saying a word. For a second, I worried I had crossed a line by making myself too comfortable inside his house. Then he quietly smiled. I cannot remember the last time someone was waiting for me with lunch. There was no sadness in his voice, only quiet surprise. We ate together around the small wooden table while Oliver told exaggerated stories about recess that became more dramatic every time he repeated them. Daniel laughed more during that single meal than I had heard since meeting him. It was not loud laughter. It was soft, genuine, and almost unfamiliar to him. As the weeks passed, little traditions appeared without anyone suggesting them. Mondays became homework afternoons at the dining room table. Wednesdays meant stopping for ice cream if Oliver finished all of his reading assignments. Fridays became movie nights, with blankets spread across the living room floor and popcorn that somehow ended up everywhere except the bowl. I kept telling myself I was only helping a neighbor through a difficult season. Yet every time I unlocked my own front door at night, my house felt strangely quiet compared to the warmth I had just left behind. Then one evening, as I gathered my jacket to head home, I overheard Oliver whisper something that made me stop in the hallway. "Daddy," he asked softly, "does Noah have to go home every night? It feels happier when he is here." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but somehow it felt much longer. I did not hear Daniel answer. Instead, I quietly stepped outside beneath the fading sunset, wondering why the little boy's innocent question had settled so deeply inside my own heart. That night, I barely slept. Oliver's innocent question echoed in my mind long after the lights in both houses had gone dark. It would have been easy to pretend I had imagined the warmth growing between us, but every shared dinner, every laugh around the kitchen table, and every quiet smile from Daniel had begun to chip away at the walls I had spent years building around my own heart. I reminded myself that I was only the neighbor. I was only helping. Crossing that invisible line would only make everything more complicated. The following Saturday morning, I was watering the flowers on my front porch when Oliver came running across the lawn with a soccer ball tucked under one arm. "Daddy said you might want to come to the park with us," he called excitedly. A few seconds later, Daniel appeared behind him carrying a folding chair and a small cooler. "There is no pressure," he said with his familiar, careful smile. "Oliver has been talking about it all morning." I could not say no to the hopeful expression on the little boy's face. The park was only a 10-minute walk away, and for the next 2 hours life felt wonderfully ordinary. Oliver chased pigeons, kicked his soccer ball across the grass, and somehow convinced both of us to join him in an enthusiastic game that neither Daniel nor I was very good at. Every time Oliver scored between two backpacks we had placed as goalposts, he celebrated as though he had just won the championship. I had not laughed that much in years. Eventually, Oliver grew tired and wandered toward the playground to climb with a group of children his age. Daniel and I sat together on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the swings. For a while, we simply watched Oliver play in comfortable silence. Then Daniel quietly spoke. "He smiles more now." I turned toward him. "He has always seemed happy to me." Daniel slowly shook his head. "Not like this. After his mother passed away, he stopped asking people to come over. He stopped inviting friends. I think he was afraid everyone would eventually leave." His words settled heavily between us. After a long pause, he continued, "I was so busy trying to be both parents that I forgot how to simply be present. Every day became a schedule. Wake him up, make breakfast, work, pick him up, dinner, laundry, bills, sleep, repeat." Somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing how lonely our house had become. His voice remained steady, but I could hear the quiet exhaustion underneath every sentence. I looked down at my hands before answering. "You are doing better than you think." He smiled faintly without looking at me. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing to you." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned back against the bench and let out a slow breath. "People who are completely happy do not move across the country without bringing a single family photo into their new home." My heart skipped. I had never told him anything about my past. He had simply noticed what was missing. For a moment, I considered changing the subject, but something about the gentle understanding in his eyes made honesty feel safe. "I used to believe I had my future planned," I admitted quietly. "Then one day, everything I trusted disappeared. Since then, I have been very good at starting over, but not very good at letting people get close." Daniel nodded as though he understood far more than I had actually said. Before either of us could continue, Oliver came running back toward us with flushed cheeks and the biggest smile imaginable. He slipped one hand into mine and the other into Daniel's before announcing proudly to everyone nearby, "Come on. My dads have to see what I built." Neither Daniel nor I corrected him, but as we exchanged one startled glance, I realized the little boy had just spoken a dream that neither of us was ready to admit had already begun to grow inside our hearts. Autumn arrived quietly, painting Maple Street with shades of amber and gold, and somewhere between changing leaves and cooler mornings, I stopped feeling like a visitor in Daniel and Oliver's lives. Every evening after work, one of them would find an excuse to knock on my door. Sometimes Oliver needed help building a cardboard volcano for science class. Sometimes Daniel claimed he had cooked too much chili and refused to let the leftovers go to waste. I knew those reasons were only excuses, and somehow neither of us felt the need to say it out loud. Then one Wednesday, everything changed. It started with an unexpected call from Oliver's school just before noon. His teacher explained that he had developed a high fever during class and needed to be picked up immediately. Daniel was nearly 2 hours away attending an important meeting, and his phone went straight to voicemail. Without thinking twice, I grabbed my keys and drove to the school. When I arrived, Oliver looked unusually quiet, his cheeks flushed and his usual bright smile replaced by tired eyes. The school nurse handed me a sheet with his temperature and suggested we contact his pediatrician if it continued to rise. During the short drive home, Oliver leaned against the passenger seat, barely speaking. My heart tightened because silence simply was not who he was. Once we reached the house, I helped him change into comfortable clothes, encouraged him to sip water, and placed a cool cloth across his forehead while waiting for Daniel to call back. Nearly 40 minutes later, the front door burst open. Daniel rushed inside with a look of fear I had never seen before. The moment he spotted Oliver sleeping on the couch, he hurried over and gently brushed the hair away from his son's forehead. His shoulders trembled with relief when he realized the fever had already begun to come down. "I am so sorry," he whispered, looking at both of us. "I should have answered sooner. I kept my phone on silent during the presentation." "You are here now," I replied quietly. "That is what matters." The pediatrician recommended rest, fluids, and monitoring through the evening, assuring us there was no immediate cause for alarm. Even after hearing those reassuring words, Daniel refused to leave Oliver's side. As daylight faded beyond the living room windows, we took turns checking his temperature and reading his favorite adventure book whenever he woke for a few minutes. Around midnight, Oliver finally opened his eyes with enough energy to smile. "I feel better," he whispered before drifting back to sleep. The relief that filled the room was almost overwhelming. Daniel lowered his head into his hands, and for the first time since I had met him, the strong, dependable father allowed himself to break beneath the weight of weeks, months, perhaps years of quiet worry. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Ever since my wife died, I have lived with one fear every single day. I keep wondering what happens if I fail him too. What if one day I cannot protect the only person I have left?" I moved closer without thinking and rested a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You are not carrying this alone anymore." Daniel looked up at me, his eyes shining with gratitude and emotions neither of us was ready to name. He covered my hand with his own and held it there for a long moment. Neither of us spoke. Across the room, Oliver slept peacefully, completely unaware that while his fever was finally fading, the walls around two guarded hearts had quietly begun to disappear. Life settled into a rhythm that felt so natural it almost frightened me. Oliver recovered completely within a few days, and before long he was back to racing down the sidewalk after school, proudly showing me every drawing, spelling test, and handmade craft he brought home. Daniel no longer waited until the last minute to ask for help. Instead, he simply knocked on my door each evening with an easy smile that seemed to grow a little more genuine every week. Sometimes we cooked together. Sometimes we walked through the neighborhood while Oliver rode his bicycle a few yards ahead of us. Other nights we simply sat on the back porch after Oliver had fallen asleep, sipping hot coffee beneath a sky full of quiet stars. There was never any pressure to fill the silence. Somehow, silence had become comfortable instead of lonely. One Friday evening, Daniel surprised me by inviting me to the annual Maple Street Fall Festival. "Oliver has been talking about the pumpkin carving contest for a month," he said with a small laugh. "He insists we need a third teammate." I pretended to think about it for a moment before smiling. "I suppose I cannot disappoint our captain." The festival filled the town square with music, food trucks, and families bundled in light jackets against the crisp October air. Oliver darted from booth to booth with endless excitement, proudly dragging both of us behind him. He insisted we share fresh apple cider, challenged us to a beanbag toss competition, and laughed so hard during the hayride that several strangers around us could not help smiling too. More than once, people greeted Daniel warmly before looking at me and saying things like, "Your family is adorable," or "Your son is the happiest kid here." Every single time, Daniel simply smiled instead of correcting them. I noticed it, and judging by the quiet glance he gave me each time, he knew I had noticed too. Later that evening, we entered the pumpkin carving contest. Oliver drew the face while Daniel carefully carved the outline, leaving me responsible for cleaning out the inside. By the time we finished, our pumpkin wore an uneven grin that looked more charming than perfect. Oliver hugged both of us at once after the judges announced we had won second place. "See," he declared proudly, "I told you we make the best team." On the drive home, Oliver fell asleep in the back seat with the small ribbon still clutched in his hand. The streets were peaceful, illuminated by porch lights and glowing jack-o'-lanterns. After carrying Oliver inside and tucking him into bed, Daniel quietly joined me on the front porch. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he broke the silence. I forgot what it felt like to enjoy ordinary days. His voice was soft, almost reflective. After Emily passed away, every happy moment came with guilt. It felt wrong to smile too much because I thought it meant I was leaving her behind. I looked at him carefully before answering. Loving the people who are still here does not erase the people we have lost. Daniel lowered his eyes, absorbing every word. I know that, he admitted. At least I am starting to. Then he looked directly at me with a tenderness I had never seen before. Noah, you have brought something back into this house that I thought was gone forever. Before I could answer, headlights swept across the front yard. A dark sedan slowly stopped in front of Daniel's house. An elegantly dressed woman stepped out, followed by an older couple. Daniel's entire expression changed in an instant. The warmth disappeared from his face, replaced by a tension I had never witnessed before. He stood so quickly that his coffee cup nearly slipped from his hand. Without taking his eyes off the visitors, he quietly whispered, "Emily's parents are here." Even before they reached the porch, I could feel that the peace we had carefully built was about to be tested in ways none of us had expected. Emily's parents stood on the porch with polite smiles that never reached their eyes. Her mother, Margaret, carried a neatly wrapped box, while her father, Richard, kept both hands folded over the handle of his cane. Beside them stood Emily's younger sister, Claire, who offered Daniel a gentle hug before noticing me. Her expression shifted ever so slightly, not unfriendly, but uncertain. Daniel introduced me with the same calm voice he always used. "This is Noah. He is our neighbor." Margaret repeated my name politely before looking past me into the house. "We came to bring Oliver his mother's favorite pumpkin pie recipe. We thought it would be nice for him to keep baking it every fall." Daniel thanked them and invited everyone inside. I quietly offered to leave, but Oliver came running downstairs the moment he heard familiar voices. He hugged his grandparents tightly before spotting me near the doorway. Without hesitation, he smiled and waved. "Noah, come help me show Grandma my pumpkin ribbon." I walked over, careful not to intrude, but I could feel Margaret watching every interaction between us. The evening remained pleasant on the surface. We shared coffee, talked about school, and listened as Oliver proudly described winning second place at the festival. Yet beneath every conversation lingered a quiet tension that became impossible to ignore. When Oliver disappeared upstairs to find another drawing he wanted to show everyone, Margaret finally spoke. "Daniel," she said gently, "Emily always dreamed this house would stay exactly as it was." Daniel looked down at his coffee cup before answering. "Some things have changed." Richard sighed softly. "We know grief changes people. We simply hope you remember that Oliver deserves stability." Claire glanced nervously between them before attempting to change the subject, but the silence had already settled across the room. A few minutes later, I excused myself and stepped onto the back porch to give them privacy. The cool evening air felt easier to breathe than the quiet discomfort inside the house. I had barely reached the porch railing when the sliding door opened behind me. Daniel joined me, closing the door quietly. "I am sorry," he said. "You should not have been put in the middle of that." I shook my head. "They love Oliver. They are protecting the family they still have." Daniel stared into the dark backyard for several seconds. "They think moving forward means forgetting Emily." His voice grew quieter. "Sometimes I worry they are right." I turned toward him. "Do you believe that?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the upstairs window where Oliver's bedroom light glowed softly. "I used to think I only had room in my heart for memories," he admitted. "Then you walked next door, and somehow this house started feeling alive again." My heart pounded so loudly I wondered if he could hear it. Before I could respond, the back door opened once more. Claire stepped outside with an apologetic smile. "I hope I am not interrupting," she said quietly. She hesitated before looking directly at me. "I just wanted you to know. Oliver talks about you every time I visit. He says he feels safe when you are here." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Just be patient with my parents. They lost their daughter. Sometimes people hold on to the past because they are terrified of losing the last piece of it." After they left later that night, Daniel walked me to my front porch like he always did. Neither of us mentioned the conversation again. Yet as he turned to go back home, he stopped halfway across the lawn, looked back at me, and almost said something. The words reached his lips, but never escaped. Instead, He gave me one lingering smile before disappearing inside, leaving me with the unmistakable feeling that the hardest decision of both our lives was drawing closer with every passing day. The days that followed felt strangely different. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. Daniel still walked Oliver to school every morning. I still picked him up every afternoon. We still shared dinners, homework, and quiet evenings on the porch. Yet an invisible distance had appeared between us, built not from anger, but from hesitation. I noticed Daniel thinking before every invitation, almost as though he was asking himself whether spending time with me was fair to anyone else. I understood exactly why. Emily's parents had never asked him to stop seeing me, but their worried expressions had planted a seed of doubt that neither of us could ignore. One evening, after Oliver had gone upstairs to brush his teeth, Daniel quietly spoke without looking at me. "My mother-in-law called today." I waited patiently. "She said she is afraid Oliver will grow up thinking his mother has been replaced." His words were careful, but I could hear the pain hiding beneath them. I stared into my untouched cup of coffee before answering. "No one could ever replace his mother." Daniel nodded immediately. "I know that." "Then maybe they will understand someday." He smiled sadly. "I wish I believed that." That night, I walked home feeling heavier than I had in months. I lay awake until after midnight replaying every conversation we had shared since the day he knocked on my door. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that healing often came with difficult choices. The next morning, I made one of my own. Before leaving for work, I slipped a handwritten note through Daniel's mail slot. It simply said, "Thank you for letting me become part of your lives. I think it is best if I give your family some space for a while." I could not bring myself to write anything more. For the next several days, I deliberately changed my routine. I left for work earlier. I returned later. I stopped walking past their house after dinner. When Daniel texted asking if I could pick Oliver up from school, I politely declined, explaining that work had become busier. None of it was true, but every small lie felt easier than becoming the reason his family carried even more conflict. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Then, one rainy Friday afternoon, someone knocked urgently on my front door. I opened it expecting a delivery driver, but instead found Oliver standing there in a bright yellow raincoat, completely soaked despite the umbrella clutched in his small hand. Daniel stood a few feet behind him, breathing hard as though they had hurried the entire way. Before I could say a single word, Oliver wrapped both arms around my waist as tightly as he could. "Please do not disappear," he whispered through tears. "Daddy does not smile anymore, and I do not like eating dinner without you." I looked up at Daniel, whose eyes were filled with exhaustion, regret, and emotions he was no longer trying to hide. Rain fell quietly around us as neither of us moved. Finally, Daniel stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "I spent my whole life believing protecting the people I love meant letting them go before they could get hurt. Then you walked away, and I realized I was not protecting anyone. I was only making all three of us lonely." He took one more step closer, his expression completely open for the first time since I had met him. "Noah, if you still have room in your heart for us, I do not want you living next door anymore. I want you standing beside us, wherever life takes us next." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rain continued to fall softly around us, but somehow it no longer felt cold. Oliver was still hugging me so tightly that I could feel his little heartbeat through his raincoat. I looked at Daniel, searching his face for hesitation, but all I found was quiet certainty. The fear that had followed him for so many years was still there, yet it no longer controlled him. I knelt beside Oliver and gently brushed the damp hair away from his forehead. "I never wanted to leave," I admitted softly. "I only thought it would make things easier for both of you." Oliver shook his head so quickly that tiny drops of rain scattered from his hood. "Home is happier when you are there." Those simple words carried more truth than any speech ever could. Daniel stepped closer until only a few inches separated us. "I spent too much time believing that loving someone new meant betraying someone I lost," he said quietly. "Then I realized something Emily once told me long before she became sick. She said that if anything ever happened to her, she hoped Oliver would always grow up surrounded by people who loved him without fear." I finally understand what she meant. I felt tears gathering in my eyes as months of uncertainty quietly slipped away. I nodded before answering. "Then let us make sure he never doubts that love again." A week later, Daniel invited Emily's parents and Claire to dinner. I was nervous from The moment I walked into the dining room, but Daniel reached for my hand beneath the table for just a second before letting go. It was enough to remind me that I was not facing the moment alone. Throughout dinner, Oliver laughed, told stories about school, and proudly announced that he wanted everyone he loved to celebrate Thanksgiving together this year. His innocent excitement softened even the heaviest conversations. Before dessert, Margaret quietly looked at me across the table. "I have been watching Oliver these past few weeks," she said. "He laughs more now than he has in years." She paused before looking toward Daniel. Emily loved seeing him smile. I think she would have wanted that to continue. Richard slowly nodded in agreement. No one spoke for several seconds, yet the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt like acceptance finding its place. As winter arrived, life settled into a new rhythm. Some evenings were wonderfully ordinary, filled with homework at the kitchen table, homemade soup simmering on the stove, and movie nights where Oliver always fell asleep before the ending. Other days brought unexpected challenges, but none of us faced them alone anymore. On Christmas morning, Daniel handed me a small wrapped box after Oliver finished opening his presents. Inside was a simple silver key attached to a wooden keychain carved with the number of their house. I looked at him in surprise. He smiled with the same warmth that had once seemed impossible. "No more knocking," he said. "You are home." Before I could answer, Oliver ran over wearing new pajamas and threw his arms around both of us at once. "Now it is perfect," he declared with complete confidence. Months later, on the first warm Saturday of spring, the three of us stood together on the front porch watching children ride bicycles along Maple Street. The flowers I had planted when I first moved in were blooming again, brighter than ever. I realized then that healing had never meant forgetting the past. It meant carrying every precious memory forward while still making room for new ones. Sometimes the greatest love stories do not begin with grand promises or perfect timing. Sometimes they begin with a tired father knocking on the neighbor's door, a little boy reaching for a stranger's hand, and three lonely hearts slowly discovering that family is not only the one you lose. Sometimes it is the one you find when you least expect it.